Vipocock Infinite is the latest and greatest first-person gooner and piece of Slavic jank that we've all been craving. You play as the gaming circle jerk's most charismatic wigger, Major Zacheyev, or P3 as he's called in-game, who always wants to remind you of how charismatic he is.
Hey, let's put a cookie in there. Yeah, even locks like cookies, right? Charles?
Yes?
Do you like cookies?
Ahem.
The game starts off with not just one, but two references to video games that they have been inspired by, i.e. BioShock and System Shock. The game itself was a project made by animators, and all of the robots have a pretty organic motion to them. The problem that I have with this is a lot of the textures are just plastered on there, and it's very disappointing for a game that's almost as big as Doom 2016 to have not as much model detail as it. When it comes to heavily reused assets, such as the separation between the hip and leg not being expressed in the models for the basic enemy. This is probably due to wanting to constrain themselves for the game to be playable, but apparently they don't have that separation for max model settings, which weirds me out a bit. The information that I have about the games in terms of texture, reflection, shadow quality, and a lot of other things that are related to graphics is very minimal. I don't have a good tower, and my DLSS won't activate on my laptop with the 3050 Ti even when plugged in, so that might be a problem for laptop players. Performance is rather decent, but even the loading with an SSD isn't amazing. I can remember there being a lot of times where I had to wait in an elevator for roughly 5 minutes. When I turned on medium settings and closed Google Chrome tabs, I ended up getting roughly 70 FPS as my average. Recording on OBS tanked the frame rate down, so most of the footage is not mine. I feel as though those are most of my critiques when it comes to non-story and gameplay related stuff, so without further ado, let's start the review.
My life is like a video game, trying hard to beat the stage, all while I am still collecting coins.
The introduction mission feels entirely different from the rest of the game. The dialogue there is much more insufferable and superfluous than the rest of it, with the main character antagonizing his glove every time it tries to help. It has the most tedious pacing in the game by having extremely short combat segments mixed in with puzzles that are longer than the combat. I think the part that exacerbates this is that there's a lot of dialogue going on during these action segments. Typically in games, you want your player to be a lot more relaxed when they're given pertinent information, so it's not uncommon to have long puzzles so that you can squeeze in the dialogue there. But here the dialogue is just all over the place, with there being a few too many instances for me to ignore. For example, later on in the game, I remember P3 saying something and then saying something on top of his original voice clip. It also doesn't help that a lot of audio logs get cut off short. Back to the tutorial, it forces the player to upgrade their weapon in a certain way and get a specific power, instead of making the latter a core game mechanic like it is in BioShock, and the former just happen when a player gets a blueprint for upgrades in the overworld. The game's locked to 55 FOV, which is egregious. It felt like it was trying to be a horror game in the first segment, but it didn't commit enough. You have way too much ammo, and since you aren't presented with other weapons at the start of the game, you don't even have to think about whether or not to disassemble it. I brought up BioShock Infinite since the game made me feel a similar way as to when I played it for the first time. Disappointment. I honestly wouldn't say I have a problem with the game not having as many features as BioShock, but since they brought up the parallels in a lot of the advertising for the game itself, I feel as though I have to do it. As a lot of reviews such as G-Man brought up, there are no effects of your powers on the environment. There are many instances in which you need the powers, mainly just shock and telekinesis for the puzzles, but it doesn't shock the water like in BioShock. The environmental lack of response made me connect the dots between this game and Infinite. In the first two games, oil spills and water leaks were prevalent in the game design and helped build up the world, whereas in Infinite you have to rip a hole through space-time. Similarly, the only way to exacerbate chemical effects is by choosing to use polymer, which is sort of like the chem gun from BioShock if it was affected by every element and came in the form of a plasmid. The problem is it kind of makes the world feel dead, and the lack of polymer, at least the reactable ones, until about halfway through the game, is rather egregious. The fact that polymer isn't used to complete a lot of puzzles is also a missed opportunity. The only instance in which I remember the environment affecting something is the hamster ball boss, which had very telegraphed statues that erect so that the hamster ball can smash into it. One of the biggest things that bugged me about the plasmids is how insane magic cooldown is in combat. It's understandable to have for the puzzles since it punishes the player for not thinking right, and gives them time to think over things, but allowing the player to use anything in combat without really having to think about it means that most encounters start with freeze and end in full health. The two most useful plasmids in the game are stuns. The freeze and telekinesis both have time to charge up, sure, but they also have a meter that depletes over time. You can choose to use only a little bit of freeze, a little bit of polymer, armor or a little bit of telekinesis, and you can back out at any moment. The thing that perplexes me is why not make Shock have a similar system. Maybe not necessarily a continuous stream of lightning, but at the very least have them have a limited amount of bolts per charge. You get canisters in the game that give your attacks elemental attributes to it, which kind of renders the Shock useless as a combat tool, especially considering you get the Electro Gun and the Dominator. The Eve system in Bioshock blows it out of the water, by far, as it makes the player have to think about what they want to spend it on. Not relying on a limited resource and replenishing it is understandable, but I feel as though it would have been better if it were linked to 1 meter so the player can decide which plasmid they like the most as opposed to just pressing buttons out of desperation when their other favorite plasmids are on cooldown. This isn't to say that I don't want to use different stuff. I'd be fine if there was a combat encounter where the enemy uses different things, but making it so that you can't spam some power at trash mobs to dump your mana bar on just feels kind of weird. That sort of stuff is one of the funnest things in games, and it shows a sense of progression. I played the game in normal mode and didn't die after the first bathtub scene, but for once I actually do agree with journalists telling players to go on easy mode. The sponginess that the enemies have is absolutely insane. I would have liked it if the difficulty were more based on the stalker system of everyone doing more damage universally. In terms of animation, the shots feel as though they have no weight to them, since the robots keep walking after they take a shotgun shell to the face. I'm not a fan of splicer damage animations in Bioshock either. They feel like rubber dolls getting their shit rocked as opposed to something human. The worst part about this is that the robots get torn to shreds by using the melee weapons. And the animations for the melee weapons are sick despite doing less damage than the shotgun. They even have limbs being blown off and attacks that use different body parts. Just have that happen in the middle of combat, just like Killer 7. The enemy knockdown attacks also kinda suck. Some of them have this attack assist from God of War that sucks even more in this game because it doesn't apply to you. A player could get mistaken thinking that a backhand from a robot wouldn't reach them and dash backwards to get surprised when a robot teleports over to them. Another thing it has in common with God of War is how limited the camera is, because you can't see attacks behind you and you can't distinguish whether or not they're unblockable. So there's no difference between regular attack sounds and knockdown attack sounds, making it harder for the player to even know what they want to do. This can be alleviated either by having more distinct sounds, a wider camera, or a third-person camera. I find it weird to see 2 melee weapons in the tutorial, and you're given the second one after being forced to upgrade the first one. Here's where I go on a tangent. Don't worry, I'll put a timecode up if you don't want to listen to it. I like upgrading melee weapons from a mechanical standpoint since it gives you a cool new combat option to try out to break up the gameplay, but from an aesthetic standpoint it's very conflicting. The original Bioshock and System Shock you get a wrench and a pipe respectively. Both of these things are used by plumbers, a blue-collar profession. This puts the player in the position of a normal person to emphasize with the themes of class divide and atmosphere of helplessness. In Bioshock 2 and Infinite, you get the drill and the skyhook respectively. The drill acts as the fact that the player is a big daddy that's seen as a freak who won't be accepted by most people. When we also take into account that the drill was used to mine in dangerous conditions, we can appreciate the contrast of being so powerful despite being treated like the untouchables in a caste system, even below blue-collar workers. The skyhook is a means of transportation that a lot of people use, even Elizabeth is seen using it multiple times, so we can come to the conclusion that the skyhook is trying to tell us that Booker cannot move on without a violent weapon. What does the Razorbat tell us? Well, it's kinda cool. The fireman's axe would have served just fine if they only gave the player an axe and had them consistently upgrade it without giving them a bunch of other melee weapons throughout the game. It's not just a lumberjack axe, it's a fireman's axe, the symbol of someone who is a selfless hero that prioritizes human life above all else. It also fits with the blue-collar aesthetic that P3 gives off with the mechanic jumpsuit. I know that complaining about a lot more options after I just complained about the lack of options when it came to plasmids seems almost contradictory, but there's no real mechanical difference in the melee weapons aside from doing more damage, and the fireman's axe makes your camera swing around. If they had special properties that did more damage to differing enemies, then it would be a bit better. This is supposedly the purpose of the canister system, however, the robots far outnumber the amount of organic enemies in the first half of the game. At the time you get to the concert hall, the roles have switched, and there are more organic enemies than there are robotic enemies in specific areas. You don't really get to do anything complex with the canisters, like swapping them out in the middle of combat. Aside from maybe the second dungeon, you're going to be consistently using the exact same canister type throughout the entire duration of the dungeon. The only exception would be if you had a polymer, which I even tried to use the polymer plasmid. It sucks so much. There's no reason to use it instead of telekinesis. There was one instance in which I got an enemy to freeze and fall out of the air and crash, which was really cool, but the fact that it doesn't apply to the regular robots or any other enemies is very disappointing. Using freeze on them midair just freezes them in place. Freeze itself acts really weird in this regard, since robots will follow through with their attacks after thawing out, which is really annoying. The floating polymer liquids in the environment are stupid. If the player could have used it in an interesting way with the environment, like conducting electricity or being able to stretch some of it out with your telekinesis, or expand the polymer with the plasmid in order to get some treasures, that would be great. Again, Infinite wasn't good, but the skyhook was an actual good part of the game that the player can use to perform aerial strikes, avoid fire, and later on bait enemies to grab onto, leaving them vulnerable for attacks. Atomic Heart could have done something similar where the robots would chase you in these polymers and you could zap them or freeze them, or they could even zap or freeze you. However, the enemies have very little of an effect on the environment. I know that one of the bosses is able to burn the polymer that you use, but whenever there's a guy with a shock baton, they didn't shock any of the polymer I sprayed at them. On top of that, there was an instance in which I tried to run away from the encounters with them, and somehow their attack had more range than my shotgun. I would need somebody else to test it out, but I think that the attack just goes on forever, which is insane. Kinda like an arrow from Skyrim. The reuse of all the assets can get really boring, even if the player is playing it through a long stretch of time, especially considering that you don't get a lot of new weapons after the start, and here's where I talk about how all the problems converge and cave in on the game. Keep in mind, I only played the game once, but I never came across a blueprint for any of the weapons that weren't mandatory. I explored a handful of complexes and opened roughly 50 chests throughout the game, and I didn't find a single blueprint. The only weapons that I got were the mandatory ones: the Fox, the Axe, the Shotgun, the Dominator, the Makarov, and the Electro Gun. I skimmed through 2 of the long plays of the game to see if I was missing out on something, and sure enough, they only got those weapons. The weapon blueprints spawn randomly in chests throughout the world, and from what I understand, that includes 3 of them at the end of the game, and they're only accessible in the bad ending. There's no problem with having chests being RNG, since it forces the player to search around the open worlds. The problem is, the player has a lack of a sprint, there's no waypoint, there's not even a compass in the game, and there's no minimap. Okay, so the player should start exploring the area, except that there's enemies all over the place that respond after being killed in 2 minutes due to their repair bots and utter lack of stealth mechanics, except for crouch, making it hard to not be spotted. This is weird because BioShock had a hacking system that allowed you to use the security system to your advantage. You do get access to this thing called a Hawk, which allows you to turn off the enemies for 10 minutes. However, the impact that this has doesn't really matter as much because you have to encounter the Pleuch multiple times in the game as a chaser enemy in the overworld. The game reportedly had to cut 21 of the guns, so I think that this is definitely a huge problem in it. It's almost as though they just cut the guns from the games without thinking of any of the repercussions. There should have been either a pity system or a way that the player can guaranteed get a new weapon. This weapon scarcity in the game also exacerbates the problem of unlimited resources by giving you a ridiculous amount of ammo for guns that you might never get, so that you can convert them into ammo that you can use, as well as healing items. I didn't even realize that I should have more weapons in the game until somebody told me that the theater was the second to last dungeon in the game. Overall, I liked the boss fights in the game. However, I will say that the Dewdrop and the Hedge did remind me of some worse Elden Ring fights, in the sense that you had to run around an arena like a headless chicken for the majority of it. I liked the other boss fights, however, I'm not the best judge since, again, I didn't get every weapon in the game. So again, your experience with the game is going to be heavily reliant on RNG. Alright, I'm gonna start talking about some more positive things that I liked about the gameplay. I like how you can reallocate any of your skills at any point in the game. There's not a worse feeling in an RPG when you spend a lot of XP on a move that ends up being really bad, so allowing the player to try out plasmids and other skills before determining whether they're good or bad and they want to use them as part of their arsenal is a good idea. The combat itself I already criticized, but it is definitely good when it's in a lot more of an open area where you can't be pinned down and knocked down constantly. Using telekinesis to loot a bunch of things is such a cool idea, but it sometimes breaks up with audio logs. I'd still say overall it's a positive addition though. I like most of the puzzles in the game, especially the ones in the lab where you can rotate walls around and sequence break it. The one where you have to mix and match randomized colors is pretty good because it is always solvable, unlike the hacking in BioShock. It also gives you more variety than the snapping one, which I would say is the only bad puzzle in the game. I've heard people complain about some of the puzzles for being too hard, and I honestly don't see it. G-Man himself complained about the lasers, which I found very easy. Again, these are puzzles in an action game. They're challenging enough to make you think a bit, but not too much to distract from a lot of the dialogue. And I'm willing to take them over most of the first-person shooter puzzles these days. I have no problems with linear games that have limited options in terms of combat encounters, but advertising your game as a BioShock-like while having less mechanics than the mechanically worst game in the franchise is asinine. I think that this is a consequence of wanting to cave into the masses and give them a 25-hour open world with hours of Ubisoft grind content as opposed to something that's paced more tastefully. The game took me about 18 hours to beat, and 2 of those hours because my game crashed outside the tutorial without any of the saves, even though I made them on the saving machines. Another 2 of those hours were also because my game crashed right in the middle of unskippable cutscenes. The development smells of AAA poison. If someone told me that this was a Far Cry spin-off, I'd believe it if it weren't for the lack of waypoints. The pacing for the middle of the game, especially the theater, is really good. However, the tutorial and the ending kinda suck. I forgot to mention this while scripting, but a little detail I liked was the hints that Charles had in the loading menu. Even though they're rather brief, they're packed with character. It kinda makes me wish that they had loading screens to render the laboratories. I understand that they're trying to future-proof it for SSDs, but when a lot of the areas just have silence when you go up and down the elevator, having something to read before the next area fully renders would be nice. Not to mention, by the time we have that technology, chances are the game will be old enough to warrant a remaster anyways. One of the most prevalent things in the criticism of the game is the dialogue. The tutorial sounds like a conversation in the politics Discord server, with constant cussing for the sake of it. I paused my game to do some homework after I hear the cookie line. Honestly, I'm fine with most of it after the tutorial. Sure, the Major is a real bastard, and he references how annoying the situations he's in more than I'd like, but Charles was actually a cool character, and the Major cools down his hostility towards him after the tutorial and talks to Charles about not wanting to be a disappointment to Sechenov. The story isn't super heartwarming, and the big twist was really obvious if you played BioShock. It's about as on the nose as BioShock is, referencing George Orwell almost as much as BioShock references Ayn Rand. Here's where we get into more specific stuff like spoiler territory, so here's a timestamp if you want to skip that. Petrov is retarded for not telling Larissa about the malfunction, since she did even worse stuff and presumably told Petrov about it. She's also a bitch for running off on him after learning about what it is that he did, even though she's just as bad if not worse. To make matters worse, they try and pretend as though she knew about Petrov wanting to make Atomic Heart public knowledge, which makes even less sense. There's even a dialogue option in Discount Rapture where you can apologize for Petrov's death, and she says that she doesn't feel sorry because he was a different person, but just before that she says something along the lines of, "You killed him before he can explain his plan for you," as though she knew he was the one who made the robots go into combat mode, and he did it purposefully. I can't be the only one confused on this. I defend the Code Geass Season 1 ending, and even I think this is stupid. The ballerinas being P3's wife didn't have any impact on me, and the perplexing thing is that Charles brings up that he has a weakness for women when he fights the Plyush. They could have easily swapped out one of the Plyushes in the theater for a ballerina, and overall had the ballerinas be more prevalent in the game. Instead, they're only in it for 10 minutes. The twist about having false memories was very obvious from the beginning of the game. Collective is advertised as re-education without any icing on it, but I'm surprised they didn't do anything with the elevator pod at the beginning of the game, because it's not there when you wake up right after the cutscene. The thing about the glove being a person was also rather apparent after the first magnet puzzle. I know I sound like a real nitprick right now who wants to say that he thinks that every twist is obvious, but we go back to the whole entire thing about BioShock influencing this game and players for BioShock being able to see these things from a mile away. I half expected them to make Charles a good guy all the way through, but then the moment he tells P3 to throw away the rings was the nail in the coffin. In what conceivable universe would you throw away something so integral to preventing global mind control? Petrov, despite being significantly more logical and ethical than Larissa, is a cheap imitation of Sandra Cohen in his level. There's also no reason why he can't explain Atomic Heart to P3, especially when he had him chained down. It's a shame because I think his area is the best in the game. It's paced nigh perfectly, and the puzzles give you a very good idea of Petrov's character through both visuals and dialogue. I really like the relationship build up between P3 and Charles, where P3 warms up to him over time. I already made a little video on this, but my favorite dialogue exchange in the game is one where P3 is given the option to ask if the ballerinas are just used for ballerinas. Charles responds by stating the obvious, that they were used as sex bots. But then P3 asks the question of whether or not Sechenov is using his bodyguards as sex bots as well, to which Charles responds with by giving the definition of robosexuality. It might seem as though I'm trying to be contrarian to the people who don't like sexualization in video games, but I genuinely find it amazing in retrospect. For starters, the players has to initiate this dialogue. It's not in their face. Secondly, it can be seen as something to appeal to the audience who bought the game expecting a first-person Gunnar, and it's something that would be very obvious in the context of the world that builds upon it naturally. But when you get to the end of the game and find out that the two ballerinas are your wife, it wouldn't be a stretch to come to the conclusion that Sechenov wanted to have sex with your wife. Not only did he take the memories of your girl, but he's also banging her behind your back while you're doing his dirty work. This can make the player want to kill Sechenov after connecting the dots, and that's the beauty of it. Charles gave you the information that you asked for, and you put the dots together. It is your prerogative whether or not you want to kill Sechenov. On top of that, the context of Charles manipulating you the entire time makes the player think whether or not Charles was intentionally egging on P3. And the fact that I didn't see any conclusive answer made me so proud that one of the writers at Mundfish actually had some constraint and subtlety when writing this. That type of shit hits hard because it lingers after playing the game, and I'm interested in seeing a lot of fan theories about it. Then again, I didn't look in all of the terminals until Rapture, so for all I know, it does have a definitive answer. But it's better than a shitty explanation like, oh, Petrov just went a little quirky today, you know. People have been saying that there's a good and bad ending to Atomic Heart, but it's more like a lesser of two evils ending. Atomic Heart is already 99% done as a project. If he kills Sechenov, then someone else will do the 1% of the work. Especially since you were forced to throw the fucking rings away! I've heard people say it's sequel baiting the 4 DLCs in the game. My prediction is that he looks for the rings with Granny Xena in the complex, but that's just me. Overall, I really like the main character dynamic between P3 and Charles, and that makes it worthwhile enough for me. But the plot is absolutely riddled with holes, and I can't bring myself to say it's entirely good. One of the things that does strike me as interesting is the themes, because contrary to what a lot of people think, I don't think that either of the endings are badly written. Both of them have the overall cautionary message to not trust people who dedicate their entire lives to science. People who say they are helping people without any regard for morals. People who claim to be the science and are outraged at the general blue-collar public's lack of interest in scientific research. These types of people are atheists by nature and have taken atheism to its ultimate end goal of attempting to replace God. This of course makes me draw the conclusion that Atomic Heart is a sequel to Far Cry 5, the most basest game of all time. In all seriousness, having a threat almost be completed so that even if you kill the main perpetrator of it, anybody else will come and take their place and bring it to fruition is really cool. I already expected Atomic Heart to be mediocre when I heard it was going to be an open world, but it went under my expectations. There's too many mechanics that, though can be well implemented, clash with each other to the point where the majority of the game becomes a contradiction. It has a low FOV, but wants to be a grand action game. It wants you to mess with weapon variety by giving you the ability to disassemble weapons to make new ones, but makes the blueprints RNG. It wants you to explore the open world by spreading these weapons, but makes the walk speed slow, constantly bombards you with enemies, and has no orienteering mechanics in the UI. It wants to have memorable dialogue, but it has it overlap, cut off quickly, and play in intense action segments with audio tapes paced almost as poorly as in Bioshock Infinite. I'll reiterate the fact that I had practically no weapons in the game due to RNG. It's possible that anyone watching this video will have a much better experience than I did due to that, which is great for them, but isn't great game design. Nothing is equal to the sum of its parts, and in this instance, the sum of its parts is worse than the components. I'll outline some suggestions on the off chance that a developer of Atomic Heart sees this. Forcing the player to get a weapon, or at least giving them a reliable way of getting new weapons, is a good idea. Even if it's not a weapon they think they want, they'll be able to use it before choosing whether or not to have it as part of their arsenal. Allowing people to make waypoints, or at least giving them a compass, will make them more prone to exploring your environments. On the note of exploration, allow for a faster way to move. Fast travel is nice, but even just sprinting speed would be great. This is assuming the DLC is going to be as open worlds. If it's going to be more enclosed dungeons, then just ignore what I said about orienteering. With the story, don't focus too much on making twists for the sake of it. I was fine with the story going in the direction that it was before P3 threw the rings away. The ballerinas are actually important to the character, so having him react to the ballerinas in a certain way before the end, or even having him be hesitant to find a different ballerina, would have made the ending have more of an impact. I hate to say that this game is bad and leave it at that. I've been following it for half a decade, but I can't say it's mediocre or even better than that. I'd also describe a 4 out of 10 as something that I can only recommend to specific people, but the RNG here is the real deal breaker for me recommending the game to anyone, and I would harass any of my friends into refunding it if it weren't on Game Pass. With a greater focus on what it wants to be, Mundfish's future projects can be fondly remembered, and Atomic Heart would be seen as a stepping stone to that instead of being seen as a mediocre game in retrospect.